Hi everybody, welcome back to the Renaissance Woodworker. I am Shannon Rogers, your host, and I wanted to talk about toothing planes today. There's been a resurgence of the toothed blade recently when both Lie-Nielsen and Veritas released toothed blades for their planes. Over at Lie-Nielsen, Danette Polhowski actually produced an excellent video that's out on YouTube on using a toothing plane, or a tooth blade and a bevel up jack plane to deal with really tough, figured, crazy stock as a way to flatten it without causing massive tear out. The thing about toothing planes are, they're really not a new idea. This traditional style of English toothing plane has been around 300 years or so. And I wanted to look a little bit at the differences between the traditional wooden style and the more modern toothed blade used in a low angle bevel up jack plane like this. First things first, kind of the obvious issues, and you can see I've got three toothing planes here. They all have slightly different pitches to them. This plane is set back at about, I don't know, maybe 80 degrees. It's definitely a little bit more relaxed, but it's still high enough that I'm getting kind of a scraping cut. This plane is set probably 89 degrees, maybe 88 degrees. It's almost vertical, so I'm definitely getting a strong scraping cut. And this plane is just a little bit relaxed from that. So they're all in that 80 to almost 90 degrees. This plane I've actually had for several years now. I actually got it at the Brown Tool Auction up near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I guess it was about 3 years ago. And I've really enjoyed using it. I've actually had it longer than I had one of the modern toothing blades. This again has the most relaxed bedding angle to it. Very recently, and if you saw the blog post that I put out, this is the plane that I restored and brought back to health. I got the sole nice and flat. I adjusted I really didn't have any bedding issues, but I wanted to check that. Removed all the rust from the iron and sharpened the iron up really nicely. First things first, sharpening an iron of a toothing plane blade is no different whatsoever. What I really want to take a look at is the performance differences. The big thing besides the bedding angle that you'll notice between the modern toothing iron and the more vintage ones is the size of the teeth. The Veritas, this is a Veritas blade. I've actually worked with a Lie-Nielsen blade at one of their shows. I didn't really see any difference in the blades themselves. This blade has much bigger teeth, and combined with bedded at a low angle, I'm thinking it's going to be a more aggressive plane. Well, I shouldn't say I'm thinking. I know it's a more aggressive plane because I've used it. The vintage planes, I've already got this one set for cutting, so let me pull out this one that hasn't been tuned up. These have very, very fine teeth, and it makes you wonder kind of why the big difference. I think a lot of people think of the vintage toothing plane as something that's used almost entirely for veneer and what's known as keying a surface for veneer. The keys have a little bit of tracks in both the substrate and the veneer that allows the veneer or prevents the veneer from slipping around as you put high glue in place, because anybody who's used high glue knows that it can be rather slippery. Recently, the guys down in Williamsburg at the Anthony Hay Cabinet Shop produced an excellent blog post, and I urge you to check that out, that talks about using toothing planes in a lot of different surfaces, areas where they quickly kind of needed to level something down and didn't want to cause a bunch of tear out. The one thing about these vintage planes is they're really small, really tiny, and they can fit into tight little spots really nicely, which I think is pretty cool. The other thing, if you're dealing with veneer, say you want to attach this piece of walnut to a poplar substrate, and maybe this is a drawer front and I want to band the walnut with some cross grain and something else. So dealing with a small piece of veneer like this, putting this big old jack plane on top of it, it's just cumbersome. Whereas coming at it with a small plane like this is going to just make more sense, be more efficient and less tiring than lugging around this big old thing. So let's take a moment and look at how each one of these cuts. The thing that toothing blades have been made popular recently is their ability to flatten stock without causing massive tear out. And I think there's a bit of a misconception that's come from that. The toothing blade is not like a scrub plane. It's not meant for rough stock removal and to flatten a board from the sawmill. That's still the domain of the foreplane or the scrub plane to quickly hog that off, get a flat surface. Then I would go with a joiner plane to flatten and refine it even more. You're going to get tear out there. Then you come back with the tooth blade. Really, the tooth blade is the last thing you use before possibly, maybe you could go back to the joiner plane with a light cut or go straight to the smoothing plane and take shavings until you remove the teeth entirely. This is not a heavy removal tool, and I've heard of 4 or 5 people that have said they've been using the toothing blade as their kind of thicknessing plane, and that's just not what it's for. So I'm going to take a piece of ridiculously crazy figured stock. This is a piece of redwood, and if you were to look at this board and try to figure out which way the grain is running, you would not be able to figure it out. The grain runs every which way. It switches back, it dives down, there is no direction. So if I wanted to flatten this board, what I would do, and because it's already been planed previously, so it's not a matter of grabbing a scrub plane at this point, but I will come back with a joiner plane, and this is set to about a medium cut. You can see this board is pretty much already flat. I'll be honest, I flattened it before I turned on the camera. But again, I'm not getting shavings here. Well, I'm getting little segmented shavings because of the way the grain runs. I take a shaving and then I hit this end grain and it basically interrupts that chip, and I end up with lots of little pieces. So now when I look at the board, I've got a couple of smooth sections, then I've got tear out, tear out, tear out. Every other alternating band is essentially tear out. I've got a lot of tear out in here where it looks like a knot was starting to form. There's kind of a burl pattern down here that's basically just all crazy and torn out. So if I were to flip the board and go the other direction, now I've removed the tear out where I had tear out before and added tear out where I didn't have it before. So you could see this board produces just a real dickens of a problem. There's just no way to prevent the tear out. Now you could come with a finely tuned smoothing plane or something like this. Just out of experience, I've done it with this plane. I've actually tackled this board with this Lie-Nielsen smoother, and it maybe did a little bit of a difference, but especially in the spot where I've got this knot forming in this burl section, I still ended up getting tear out. So here's where the toothing plane can be really effective. I'm going to flip the board back around because I got the least amount of tear out going in that direction. I have my tooth blade in here, and I've got it set for about a medium light or lightish heavy cut at this point. Now the toothing plane definitely doesn't produce shavings. It produces kind of like dust, but it's not really dust. It's like confetti coming off the wood. And what I want to do is plane basically until I get to the bottom of the tear out. In other words, I plane the surface below the tear out I had before. So now the tear out is gone, but I have this really grooved and keyed surface, and it actually feels really cool as well. So now you come back with the smoothing plane, and I want to work those grooves out of the surface. Okay, I'm just starting to get shavings now. As soon as you start to get shavings, you're probably 1 or 2 passes from the end. And that's it. The board is now planed perfectly smooth. I do not have any tear out anymore, and It's actually a very beautiful board. Very cool looking. So that's the toothing blade as you've seen demonstrated on Lee Nielsen's YouTube channel. Really, really effective tool. Quick and easy way to remove tear out on a highly figured board. It is not a rough removal tool, or exactly, it's not a rough removal tool. Now let's come back to this smoothed surface. Let's hit it with the vintage toothing plane. Same effect. I have little shavings. Now I have even more dust appearance because I've got such a fine tooth. Now this could be used the same way that the Veritas blade was used. Say you've got a really difficult board. You went through using the Veritas blade, you smoothed it, and it looked all right, but you still had a little bit of tear out to deal with. Maybe come back with this vintage blade that has a much finer cut, and the higher angle means it's much more of a scraping cut. It's not, I don't want to say it's not nearly aggressive, it's just going to break the chips a lot faster because of that high angle. Once I've keyed the surface now, I can come back with my smoothing plane. And this is going to take much less time now because I've got very shallow grooves. That surface looks even better than the previous one. So in a lot of ways, you know, the difference between maybe going from a jack plane or a joiner plane to a smoother in that hierarchy of coarse, medium, and fine, the joiner plane being your medium plane, your smoothing plane being your fine plane, you can think of the bevel up tooth blade the same way. This is your medium plane. This would be your somewhat fine plane, because then you'll follow it up with a smoothing plane and get an absolutely immaculate board. I really, really like using these little things. The size, there is kind of a magic to using wooden planes to begin with there, but I love that I can, with such a small plane, I can come in and really work any direction very quickly. It's just a really agile plane. And with a board that is just so crazy like this, it can be really, really helpful. At the same time, it leaves such a finely keyed surface that if I were to come back and want to veneer this walnut onto it, I can come in and key the back of the walnut piece. And again, it's really easy to use on this small board. Now I've got this piece is keyed and ready to go, and this piece, and they do kind of interlock together, and I'll get an excellent glue bond. The vintage toothing planes, you know, I guess if I had to pick one, I would go with these small English style vintage planes just because they are so versatile. They work really well in so many different circumstances. Really comfortable to use. They really do a good job with highly figured woods. And if you do get into veneering and working on smaller pieces like drawer fronts, you'll just find it's so much easier than this big heavy thing. So now I'm going to come back and reflatten this, or re-smooth it rather. It's pretty flat. And we are good to go. So you'll find that it's two birds of a feather, kind of, sort of, but they are different beasts. They're both toothing planes. They both can be used for keying veneer, for dealing with highly figured rough surfaces. This one you'll just find is a little bit more subtle than the bevel up one, certainly more agile. So if you're interested, you can find these things basically all over eBay. You can find them in flea markets. I don't know whether they have become more popular since the guys at Anthony Hay shop wrote up that little article. The price certainly doesn't seem to be affected at this point. You can still get them relatively cheaply. I think the most I ever paid for it was this little one at the Brown Tool Auction, and I got it for about $35, I think. So they're not really something that is going to break the bank. They're relatively easy to obtain. It may take a little bit of work to get them up and running again, but I think they can be a valuable tool in your arsenal.